The sound of waves can be gentle until someone claims ownership of the entire ocean. And this week, East Africa woke up to a sentence that felt like a storm rolling in from the horizon. That ocean belongs to me. In the future, we are going to have wars. Those were the words of Uganda's President Yoweri Museveni, words that cut sharply across living rooms, radios, and phone screens from Nairobi to Mombasa. For many older Kenyans, it felt like a painful echo of the region's turbulent past, a reminder that peace can be shaken not by gunfire, but by a single sentence. At the same time, something even more unsettling happened quietly on Kenyan soil. As Kenyans argued online about whether Museveni was joking or making a veiled threat, a delegation of Ugandan soldiers crossed the border not for battle, but for closed-door meetings in Nairobi. Their arrival happened just hours after the ocean remark, and for millions watching, the timing felt far too perfect to ignore. If you're someone who remembers the tense decades after independence, if you lived through the stories of border conflicts and shifting alliances, you know one thing better than anyone: leaders' words matter. They can calm nations or they can shake them. And when a president talks about future wars, while his army visits the neighbor he was talking about, even the quietest person begins to ask questions. Is East Africa witnessing a misunderstanding blown out of proportion, or the first rumblings of something deeper? Was Museveni really speaking in metaphors, or was this a message crafted for a different audience back home? And most importantly, what does this sudden military visit truly represent behind the scenes? Stay with us, and if you care about stability, truth, and the future of African sovereignty, share your thoughts below. Subscribe if you believe that the truth is more important than the headlines. Long before the political statements began shaking the region, ordinary Kenyans were going about their routines: fishermen pulling in their nets along the coast, truck drivers lining up at the port of Mombasa, and traders depending on the steady flow of goods that move through Kenya's vital shoreline. None of them could have imagined that a single sentence about the ocean would thrust their everyday stability into global headlines. Yet that is exactly what happened when President Yoweri Museveni declared on live television that the Indian Ocean belongs to him and that future wars might be fought over it. His words landed like a flare shot into the night sky. Immediately, social media platforms across Kenya erupted with disbelief and anger. For many Kenyans, this was not just about a territorial claim. It felt like an unnecessary provocation from a longtime neighbor. Uganda, after all, depends entirely on Kenya's coastline for trade. The port of Mombasa is the lifeline through which fuel, food, machinery, and essential goods reach the landlocked country. For decades, the two nations have managed this dependency with relative calm, even as political tensions rose and fell. So to hear a Ugandan president talk about future wars created a sense of shock that spread far beyond the political class. But the story took an even stranger turn when, just hours after the controversial interview aired, a delegation of senior officers from the Uganda People's Defense Forces arrived quietly in Nairobi. Their presence was not announced with the usual diplomatic fanfare. No public speeches, no extended press briefings. Instead, it was a discreet entry framed officially as a benchmarking exercise, a routine visit, they said, to study Kenya's Defense Forces Welfare Services, a program focused on improving soldiers' well-being and supporting military families. Leading the Ugandan delegation was Major General Francis Takirwa, a respected commander within Uganda's land forces. His team toured the Moi Air Base in Eastleigh, visited the Embakasi Defense Complex, and held multiple closed-door meetings with high-ranking Kenyan defense officials. On paper, everything looked normal, the kind of intermilitary cooperation that happens quietly all year round between friendly nations. But this time, the context transformed a simple visit into a national conversation. Kenyan citizens already processing Museveni's remarks about the ocean could not ignore the timing. Many asked the question that now loomed like a shadow over Nairobi: was this really a routine military exchange, or was something deeper unfolding behind the scenes? Even seasoned analysts struggled to separate coincidence from strategy. In international relations, timing is rarely accidental, and silence often speaks louder than words. Kenyan officials, for their part, tried to keep the temperature low. Statements from the Kenya Defense Forces emphasized that the visit had been scheduled in advance. But beyond the scripted language, there was an unmistakable air of caution. Meetings were conducted professionally, but without unnecessary publicity. Officers who normally engage the press chose not to comment. The Kenyan side wanted cooperation, but also clarity. Meanwhile, political observers in Uganda pointed to an entirely different angle. Museveni is facing a heated political climate at home and gearing up for what he calls his final election campaign. Some Ugandan commentators suggested that his remark about the ocean was not intended for Kenyans at all, but for Ugandan voters who feel frustrated by their nation's economic constraints. In other words, the president's sweeping claim may have been designed to stir national pride rather than provoke conflict. But intentions aside, the experience for ordinary East Africans was unsettling. People who grew up hearing stories of the Uganda-Tanzania conflict of the 1970s could not help but feel a flicker of old anxieties. Borders may be peaceful today, but memories run deep. And when a leader speaks of wars, those memories come rushing back in ways that data and diplomacy cannot fully control. At this stage, one truth became clear. The combination of Museveni's words and the military delegation's perfectly timed arrival had transformed a simple regional conversation into a major geopolitical moment. And for millions watching, the question remained painfully relevant: was this a misunderstanding or the beginning of something more serious? As news of the Ugandan delegation's arrival circulated quietly, a different kind of storm was building online. Across Kenya, thousands of ordinary citizens, teachers, drivers, retired civil servants, young professionals filled social media with questions that their leaders were not yet answering. The timing was too sharp, too precise, too delicate to be ignored. How could Uganda's president warn of future wars over access to the ocean, and then within hours dispatch his top military officers into the very country he had just referenced? To many Kenyans, the contradiction felt like a tightening rope, and this is where the story reached its emotional high point. For older Kenyans, especially those who remember the Cold War era or the lingering instability of the region's past, the combination of provocative words and discreet military diplomacy triggered a familiar unease, the sense that something important was happening behind curtains while the public was left with only fragments to decipher. Political analysts in Nairobi stepped in quickly, giving interviews that tried to break down the moment before panic could take root. Many stressed that Museveni's words were likely symbolic, a metaphor for economic inequity, not an actual threat of war. They pointed out Uganda's historical frustrations with being landlocked and dependent on foreign ports. But even these explanations came with warnings. Metaphors, especially those spoken by presidents, carry consequences. And the public rarely forgets statements that mention war, no matter how figurative they might have been. Then came the Kenyan government's turn to respond. For more than 24 hours, officials remained silent, hoping perhaps that the controversy would fade. But as public tension rose, Foreign Affairs Principal Secretary Korir Singh-Oei finally addressed the issue on November 12th. His tone was calm, deliberate, almost surgical. He insisted that Museveni's comments had been taken out of context. He called them metaphorical, not literal. He reminded the region that Kenya and Uganda share deep intertwined interests: economic, military, and social. But even as Singh-Oei spoke, one detail gave away the underlying seriousness. The Kenyan Defense Forces continued to treat the Ugandan visit with a quiet, watchful caution. Cooperation went on as publicly scheduled, but every movement of the Ugandan delegation was observed closely. Every meeting was documented, every conversation handled with measured diplomacy. Kenya was neither accusing nor yielding, it was balancing. On the Ugandan side, reactions were just as complex. Museveni's supporters defended him passionately, saying he was merely expressing frustration about regional inequalities. For them, his declaration about the ocean was a reminder that Uganda has long been trapped by geography, forced to rely on its neighbors for a route to global markets. They argued that he was speaking to Ugandans, rallying them during a heated election season by highlighting issues voters cared deeply about: trade, national dignity, and economic freedom. Yet even among Ugandans, there were voices of concern. Older citizens remembered the country's painful history with conflicts: the clashes with Tanzania in the 1970s, the destabilizing wars that had drained lives and resources. They questioned whether raising the specter of war, even rhetorically, was wise for a nation still healing from decades of internal and regional instability. The military visit itself continued to create mixed interpretations. Some observers saw the delegation as a reassuring signal, proof that despite political noise, Uganda and Kenya's defense forces remained committed to cooperation. Others perceived a more calculated message, a reminder that Museveni could speak boldly, while his military quietly maintained diplomatic ties, allowing him to appeal to nationalists at home without fully damaging international relationships. The climax came when Kenyan Air Force Commander Major General Bernard Waliala met the Ugandan officers and diplomatically ignored Museveni's statement altogether. He focused instead on institutional learning, soldier welfare, and strengthening ties. His silence on the ocean comment said everything. Kenya would not escalate. Kenya would not panic. But Kenya was paying attention. And as East Africans watched the unfolding drama, the bold words, the cautious diplomacy, the symbolic gestures, one thing became clear. The region was caught between reassurance and suspicion. The temperature was not boiling, but it was warm enough that every statement, every visit, every handshake now carried new weight. While diplomats and generals exchanged formal handshakes behind closed doors, the emotional weight of Museveni's words settled heavily on the people who live closest to the border: farmers, traders, truck drivers, and port workers whose lives depend on peaceful cooperation between Kenya and Uganda. For them, this was not an abstract political debate. It was a direct question about safety, stability, and the future of their daily livelihoods. In towns like Busia and Malaba, where families have built cross-border relationships for generations, the tension created an unfamiliar kind of quiet. Truck drivers whispered about whether stricter checks might be introduced. Traders wondered if transport fees would rise. Mothers who run small shops asked whether a diplomatic misstep could disrupt the steady flow of fuel, food, or medicine. Even the smallest hint of instability can ripple quickly through communities that depend so heavily on open roads and predictable trade. Kenya's coastal residents felt it even more personally. The port of Mombasa is not only a national asset, it is the beating heart of East Africa's commerce. When a foreign leader suggests that this ocean belongs to him, it stirs deep anxiety about sovereignty and economic security. Fishermen who have worked those waters for decades listened to Museveni's words with a mix of disbelief and resentment. "How can someone claim the ocean?" one elder reportedly asked. "The sea is older than all of us." Politically, the remark placed Kenya's leadership in an uncomfortable position. The government needed to project calm without appearing weak, to emphasize regional unity without ignoring a direct provocation. This delicate balance forced officials to adopt a slow, cautious approach, one that reassured citizens while preventing escalation. The Foreign Affairs Office framed the statement as a misunderstanding, even as the defense forces quietly tightened internal monitoring. It was a dance familiar to anyone who has watched fragile regions navigate sensitive diplomatic storms. In Uganda, the political consequences were equally complex. Museveni's remark fed into long-standing frustrations among Ugandan citizens who feel constrained by the country's landlocked status. For some, his bold reference to the ocean was a symbolic cry for independence and economic dignity, a message that Uganda should not always feel held back by geography or reliant on its neighbors. But for others, especially older generations who lived through past conflicts, the comment triggered painful memories. They understood too well how political rhetoric can spiral into unintended consequences. Even indirect allusions to war can unsettle communities still healing from decades of violence. The remark also complicated Uganda's diplomatic image across East Africa. At a time when the region is striving for deeper integration, shared currencies, joint infrastructure, unified markets, the idea of fighting over the ocean felt like a step backward. It raised questions about whether national politics were beginning to overshadow regional commitments. Within the East African community, partners quietly wondered if Museveni's outburst hinted at deeper frustrations that might resurface again. For international observers, the episode reinforced a critical reality. East Africa's stability relies heavily on clear communication and mutual respect among its leaders. Words carry power in this region, more power than tanks sometimes, because borders are porous, economies are connected, and communities live intertwined lives. When language becomes reckless, the ripple effect reaches well beyond the halls of government. By the end of the week, the political and civilian consequences formed a sobering picture: heightened public anxiety, strained diplomatic messaging, renewed questions about sovereignty, and a quiet but unmistakable shift in regional dynamics. The region had avoided crisis, at least for now, but the emotional and political aftershocks continued to vibrate beneath the surface. From Washington to Brussels, from Addis Ababa to New York, President Museveni's remarks did not pass unnoticed. In international diplomacy, language is currency, and when a sitting head of state speaks about future wars over the Indian Ocean, analysts around the world begin reading between every line. For global powers that rely on East Africa as a strategic anchor of stability, the situation raised familiar concerns. How fragile is the region? How quickly could a symbolic dispute become a real one? And what does this mean for the geopolitical balance of the Indian Ocean, one of the most valuable maritime corridors on Earth? In the United States, policymakers viewed the episode through the lens of long-term regional security. Kenya remains one of Washington's most important allies in Africa, a partner in counterterrorism trade and diplomatic cooperation. Any turbulence between Kenya and Uganda, even rhetorical, threatens to disrupt a fragile architecture built over decades. American officials are well aware that instability in one corner of East Africa can swiftly spill into others, affecting shipping lanes, trade routes, and wider security operations. For older Americans who remember the strategic anxieties of the Cold War, the idea of a key ally facing even the suggestion of conflict is unsettling. At the same time, U.S. analysts could not ignore the political motivations behind Museveni's words. Many recognize that he is navigating a tense domestic environment, and that strong, emotive language often plays well with voters who feel marginalized economically. But from a global standpoint, this kind of rhetoric risks eroding confidence in Uganda's commitment to regional peace, a concern that may influence how Washington approaches military aid training programs and diplomatic engagement moving forward. Europe's reaction followed a similar pattern. The European Union has invested heavily in East African stability through trade programs, humanitarian support, and maritime security initiatives. Any hint of territorial dispute over the ocean, especially involving a major trade artery like Mombasa, sends alarm bells through Brussels. The EU depends on predictable shipping movements through the Indian Ocean, and even symbolic threats can shake investor confidence. For European observers, the military delegation's timing added an unnecessary layer of ambiguity to an already sensitive moment. Across Africa, the African Union and the East African Community took a more cautious approach. Publicly, their responses remained measured, emphasizing dialogue and regional cooperation. But privately, diplomats expressed concern that Museveni's statement reflected deeper frustrations, long simmering beneath the surface frustrations about geography, trade dependency, and the slow progress toward regional integration. Within the EAC, some analysts warned that unresolved economic grievances could evolve into political flashpoints if not addressed with transparency and urgency. China and Russia, meanwhile, saw an opportunity in the unfolding tension. Both nations have expanded their influence in East Africa by offering military training, economic partnerships, and infrastructure investments. Moments of diplomatic friction between African nations often create openings for external powers to strengthen bilateral ties. For Beijing and Moscow, Museveni's outburst was not just a controversy, it was a signal that Uganda might be drifting toward new strategic alliances. But amid all these global interpretations, the underlying truth remained simple: stability in East Africa matters far beyond its borders. The region is a gateway for global trade, a hub for international security cooperation, and a geopolitical crossroads where the interests of world powers intersect. A misinterpreted sentence or an ill-timed military visit may not start a war, but they can shape narratives, shift alliances, and alter the balance of influence in ways that persist long after the headlines fade. In the end, what unfolded between Kenya and Uganda over just a few days became far more than a diplomatic misunderstanding. It revealed something deeper: the fragile threads that hold regions together, the quiet tensions that live beneath trade agreements and shared borders, and the reality that peace is not simply the absence of war, but the presence of responsible leadership. One sentence about the ocean might seem small on the surface, but for nations built on interdependence, even a careless word can shake confidence, unsettle families, and awaken memories of past conflicts that so many hoped were long buried. For everyday East Africans, the fishermen on the coast, the transport workers along the highways, the market women at border towns, and the elders who have lived through earlier decades of turmoil, the episode was a reminder that stability is precious and never guaranteed. And for those around the world watching from afar, including many Americans who understand the value of diplomacy shaped over generations, it offered a sobering truth. Global peace is often threatened not by bombs or armies, but by pride, rhetoric, and timing. Because when a president speaks about future wars and his soldiers appear in a neighboring capital days later, even the most cautious observer cannot ignore the symbolism. It does not mean that war is coming, but it does mean that the region must tread carefully. Words can build bridges, but they can also light fires. And in a world already strained by geopolitical rivalries and rising nationalism, East Africa cannot afford missteps rooted in ego or domestic politics. The deeper question now is not whether Museveni meant what he said or whether Kenya overreacted. The real question is what comes next. Will leaders in the region sit down, reaffirm their commitments, and address the long-standing economic frustrations that fuel such outbursts? Or will unresolved tensions continue to hang over the Indian Ocean like a gathering storm? And for you watching from across the ocean, understanding how quickly global events can shift your perspective matters too. Do you believe this was simply political theater or the early sign of a larger regional struggle? Should Kenya and Uganda rethink their diplomatic approach before something preventable grows into something far more dangerous? Share your thoughts below. Your voice helps keep the conversation grounded in truth and reason. And if you believe that honest discussion is more important than political noise, and that stability in places like East Africa matters for the entire world, subscribe to the channel. Because in moments like this, when headlines spark fear and uncertainty, staying informed isn't just helpful, it's necessary.